you to Taylor and Nancy for opening up the national dialogue here. I am actually joining you from the Coast Salish, Wasanich, and Lekwungen territories of southern Vancouver Island, and it is a beautiful day here. It's funny with COVID came. I mean, obviously, it's like anything in life. It's the good, the bad, and the ugly. It's sort of like the yin and yang, or the beautiful mess of life, um, where I've been able to be at home for, well, I guess since March 14th. So I don't know how many weeks that is now, but anyways, I haven't been traveling, and it's been really nice to be at home, and the weather has also lightened up, and it's quite beautiful here. So I'm joining you very well rested in the Coast Salish territories here. I myself am from the west coast of Vancouver Island. On my father's side of my family, we're New Channel peoples. And on my mother's side of my family, my mother was born in St. Boniface, where the two rivers come together in Winnipeg, Manitoba. And her father, my grandfather, immigrated to Canada from Europe, and were Dutch Mennonite on that side. So I come from sort of two cultural backgrounds, and both of those cultural worldviews inform the work that I do. And interestingly, um, it's both peoples, like on my mom's side of my family, were Dutch Mennonite and very communally minded, sort of God-fearing, salt of the earth farmers. My mom grew up on a farm in the prairies, and then on my father's side, we're New Channel, indigenous to Canada, and whale hunters, and but also very community minded. And both cultures have the same shared value for social justice or social well-being, community well-being. My late grandfather actually became a very successful farmer in Manitoba. If any of you know the prairies at all, the Enns family has a bit of a reputation for agriculture. Anyways, and one of the things that he taught me was that, and he left school in grade 5 and went to work basically, and very entrepreneurial. And he said that even if somebody else is in a desperate way, when you're doing a business deal, you always have to do a fair deal. You never take advantage of somebody when they're in a vulnerable state in business, and I think that goes for life in general. And by holding true to that value in others, my grandfather on my mom's side gained a very good reputation as a fair business person and as a good community member. Um, and I think those values and principles come out in situations like this, where there's a lot of people who are experiencing hardship and whatnot, and there's a lot of fluctuation of well-being. And then my mom went out to the West Coast, or came out to the West Coast in the 1970s, and sort of writing, the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War draft dodgers, the women's liberal rights, all of that hippie flower child movement stuff, and ended up on the West Coast in the 1970s in Tofino on the west coast of Vancouver Island, where my late father is from. He was born in Heshquid, Hot Springs, and grew up on an island called Mears Island, which was the first tribal park 36 years ago in 1984. And so it was those two cultures that came together, the hippies and the First Nations or Nuu peoples that came together 36 years ago to around shared values of environmental and social justice, basically. And so my life has sort of followed that. And interestingly, when I first started doing this work of tribal parks and IPCAs 15 years ago, after I graduated, I went to university and I got a degree in political science and specializing in constitutional law and international dispute resolution. So I was particularly interested in geopolitics. So earth politics, Latin for earth, geopolitics in the Canadian constitutional development was tracking how power and authority affected land management, and how that evolved over what we know today as Canada. Um, and then with an emphasis on peace studies or international dispute resolution, it was ingrained in me coming from the fact that half my family is, blonde hair, blue eyed immigrants from the Netherlands, and then half is, New Channelth, Indigenous peoples. I think probably that played a major factor in my interests in international dispute resolution. And and then after graduating from university and coming home to work to forward the nation rebuilding efforts of my own nation, Tlaoquid, on my father's side. Interestingly, the elders at the time, they said that, they said, number one, when it comes to anything regarding the land, they told me that we have to ensure that there are places in our traditional territories of safe refuge. And as you may know, all Indigenous peoples across Canada had experienced to varying degrees the impacts of smallpox, in the mid 1800s and whatnot. Um, and so there's stories that have been passed down on the west coast of Vancouver Island about the impacts of smallpox. And what the elders said 15 years ago when I started doing this work is they said we have to always ensure that there are places of safe refuge. That if there's another smallpox epidemic, that we need to ensure that there are places in our territory where the children, the grandchildren, and the great grandchildren can go for quarantine, and that when they're up in those places, and this is what happened in 5 generations ago, there was a lady named Tlauk, a great ancestor that I am on my father's side descendant from. That they said that Tlauk took her family up to a small lake in the Clayoquot River Valley. And the elders told me when I was a young university graduate that we have to ensure that that lake and that river valley remain viable and intact for the basic provision of life and clean air, clean water, food systems, shelter, and all the things that we need to continue on as a people if there is another smallpox type epidemic. So, and inherent in that forewarning and that advice and direction from the elders is implicit directions for what we can think of today as essential economics. So, pop quiz. Does anyone here know what the word economy means? Caitlin. You don't have to answer right now, but I'm just saying, like, just think about the word economy. It's related to the word ecology and the word ecosystem. These three words are cousins in the English language, but they come from an older language. It's the language of Greek. In the Greek root of economy, ecology, and ecosystem, eco comes from the Greek word oikos. Is everyone Googling the word economy right now? Just kidding. Oikos, O-I-K, oikos, O-I-K-O-S, oikos. And oikos in the Greek language means house. So the wise and prudent management of the house. And ecology is the study of oikos, the interrelationship of all things within the metaphorical house that we all call home. And so essential economics is about looking kind of like at Maslow's hierarchy of needs. What are the basic things that we need? We need clean air, clean water, food, the ability to provide shelter, clothing, love and interconnection, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and to be able to ensure through diversified regional economic systems that we can provide those basic necessities of life. And that's what I consider to be essential economics. And that's what the elders advised and directed us to do, is to ensure that regardless of the variety of trends and fashionable things and frivolous things, that we always ensure that we maintain the ability to provide those basic necessities of life. And it's kind of fascinating from my perspective, because this is the direction that we've been given for the last 15 years. But when I look back into the archives in 1914, there was a meeting that happened on Mears Island in the village of Opitsat, where my father grew up. And they were visited at that time by agents of the Crown, of the federal government. And it was called the Royal Commission of Indian Peoples of British Columbia in 1914. And it was sort of a temperature check by the Crown in a post-Confederation Canada, where the British Columbia entered Confederacy in 1871, but failed to complete its obligations to the Royal Proclamation of 1763 to make good on those treaty promises. Like I hear Nancy acknowledging Treaty 7, and the reality is, and I'll tell you this, I had a group of students here in my place here last year from Quest University, and they were introducing themselves as settlers. And I understand that, and I think that's important for that kind of thinking to happen. But what I said to that young fellow there is, I said, "Why are you still settling?" I said, "Stop settling. We don't need you to settle anymore. And what we need is allies." And that's what the old peace and friendship treaties were all about. It's peace and friendship allies. If you don't want to be a destroyer, if you don't want to be a settler, settling the West, it's got all kinds of negative connotations associated with it. but I understand it's hip and trendy for people who are good-hearted people like yourselves who want to say the right thing and are struggling to find the right way to talk about it. You introduce yourself as a settler. Well, I met with the Stony Nakotas, and I smoked the peace pipe with those guys down in Kananaskis, and what they're willing to do is they're willing to embrace you as allies, peace and friendship allies, and that's where it all comes down to. That's what makes Canada a unique country, is it's founded on peace and friendship allies. When the Crown set out to settle the West, it was actually part of a betrayal of the original peace and friendship treaties. So that's where the term settling or settlers came from. And today it's a blanket acknowledgement that you don't belong or you don't have deep founded roots or something like that, which I think, might be a healthy psychological exercise to go through. But at the end of the day, we need allies. We need people who are good-hearted and believe in social justice, just like the hippies back in the 1970s. Make love, not war, and don't destroy the environment. And so peace and friendship, that's where that whole thing comes from, Canada, which is a Haudenosaunee word. It means village. So where did I get sidetracked there, Caitlin? I went down a rabbit hole. Um, Point being is with the Tribal Parks Initiative and with the smallpox epidemic, that and the land acknowledgement that that we're doing out here on the West Coast is around building allies. So that's where I would switch to talk about the tribal parks allies and this building an alternative economy based on essential economics. So the elders gave us direction to ensure that there are these places of safe haven and that we're always able to provide for the children and the grandchildren with the basic necessities of life. We call that essential economics. And and so that's easier said than done. And when you think about transforming a national economy, it can be quite daunting and overwhelming. And so our strategy that we've been utilizing to do this is something called tribal parks or indigenous protected and conserved areas. Now, 500 years ago on the west coast of Vancouver Island, there was no such thing as tribal parks. And there was no need for indigenous protected and conserved areas because the economy of New Channel peoples was based on the concept of Isak and Hishuk Ishtzawak and, Uyathlak Nish, Uyathlak Asma. Those were some of the guiding principles of our economic relations. Niwasnish Nisma, and it's the reciprocity, the interchange of energy in the system. And so taking a piece of our land and claiming it to be special, that we should save for nature, was illogical from a New Channel perspective. And because our economy itself was closer to the Greek understanding of oikos, the wise and prudent management of the house, that there was no need for special protected areas or tribal parks. But today, now, fast forward to 1984, and the intensification and sophistication of technology and the ability to liquidate natural resources at a tremendous rate required for Indigenous peoples with our allies to innovate interventions that would slow down that rate of destruction. And so that in 1984, that's what the Mears Island Tribal Park was. And and what my uncle Moses, so my uncle Moses Martin was our elected chief counselor in 1984, and he's been our chief on and off since then. He's also our chief counselor as well, and he's still providing leadership. He's advancing in years, but has a lot of wisdom to guide our people. He always told me that, um, like the mother bear, we have a responsibility to ensure that our boundaries are kept. And so the bear crest, and the laws of nature that the mother bear provides to us, provides the logic, moral, and legal responsibility to peacefully blockade in 1984 the clear-cut logging, industrial logging of the ancient cedar rainforests of Mears Island. But it's also our same responsibility to provide alternatives, and to be equally passionate and driven towards, if you don't want the industrial logging, well, what do you want instead? And so this idea of a micro economic strategy, like an indigenous protected and conserved area, is based on watershed boundaries. So that's an example of a model that you can use to forward regional development priorities. And so transforming a national economy is much more plausible if you do it region by region. At the grassroots watershed level, Indigenous peoples, local governments, allies, ethical entrepreneurs, civil society organizations, and academia that share that vision on a watershed by watershed basis, we can create a collage or a patchwork of innovative microeconomic systems that together comprise elements of a national economy. And I just think it's absolutely brilliant to see, like yesterday on the national, there's, Donald Trump, he tried to shut down the flow of N95 masks made by 3M for frontline hospital workers and whatnot. And so the response from the Canadian manufacturing sector was to revamp and retool all of their facilities to mass produce personal protective equipment, or PPE. And there's a really compelling narrative that's evolving in the Canadian consciousness around the need to be able to meet all of those supply chain elements for PPE domestically within our own geopolitical boundaries. And so this is music to my ears, because this is what our elders have been talking about this forever, to make sure that you're able to provide those basic necessities of life. And so, yeah, I think that COVID-19 is an opportunity for us to rethink, revisit the question, what makes a life worth living? And to reimagine what kind of an economy and what kind of a society that we want to have. And, and I use those words interchangeably. And I know for a lot of people, the word economy has become synonymous with job creation and development. But I think we need to repatriate the word economy in the true sense of the word economy, which is around the wise and prudent management of the house, and ask that question, how can we create a more fair and just society? And realizing that the sky is not going to fall if the gross domestic product doesn't needle up for a few weeks or a few months, or even maybe 18 to 24 months. So the real question is, who are you self-isolating with? What is your island? Who do you want on your island for the next 18 to 24 months? Anyways, so those are that's my opening thoughts about all of this, and there's a lot of exciting developments and interesting opportunities that are arising from this. But I figured I would pause at this moment and see if there are any questions or reflections that people want to offer.
So if anyone does have a question, you guys can just unmute yourselves, or you could type it in the chat box and I'll read it out for you.
I have a ton of questions, Eli, but I always have a ton of questions for you. But I'm gonna leave it to the participants to ask first, and then maybe then we can.
Maybe you could warm up, oh no, there's somebody jumping on there.
Yeah.
I'll just read it out, and then that way it can get translated through French as well. So what are some examples of how the economy is being rebuilt within watersheds? And that's from Tanisha.
Okay, so the one example that I'll share with you that I know best is on the west coast of Vancouver Island, Clackwood Sound. Someone's tapping a question. MC. Okay, there you go. So on the west coast of Vancouver Island in Clackwood Sound, 36 years ago, the main businesses that were happening were primary industry focused. So we can think of industry in three broad categories: primary, secondary, and tertiary sectoral development, right? So primary is focused on extraction of natural resources. Secondary industry is around value added, so it's processing. Like primary might be cutting down trees. Secondary is churning those trees into products that can be used for housing construction or whatnot. Tertiary is on things like on the sale of those goods, or tertiary is also like information technology and other non-primary or secondary focused industries. Arguably tourism is an example of tertiary sector developments. And so on the west coast of Vancouver Island 40 years ago, it was a primary industry focused economy. Clear-cut logging and clear-cut fishing and some mining. Those were the only businesses that were flourishing. And so the Mears Island blockades happened in 1984, and the Mears Island court case happened in 1985. And there was an opportunity for different types of sector development to happen. And so we have now a tourism sector. Now that tourism sector is being shut down by COVID-19. But it's a good thing we didn't put all of our eggs in one basket, because we also invested in clean technology. So we have clean energy production that our nation sells energy to the grid to provide for electrical needs, as well as ecosystem services. And there is still some primary extraction that happens and value added, some local value added and regional value added. And so it's still a work in progress, but we're looking at minimizing the amount of raw export of our trees and doing all that value added locally. So we have now 4 tribal parks. We've got the Mears Island Tribal Park, Haukman, Tranquil, and Esawista tribal parks. And those 4 IPCAs are working together to block certain kinds of industry from happening, but also to encourage alternatives. So Clayoquot Sound is one example. I also worked up in northern Ontario with the Chapleau Crown Provincial Game Preserve, and that was the Northeast Superior Regional Chiefs Forum that worked collaboratively with several municipalities, Lakehead University, industry, and some civil society organizations like EcoTrust Canada to develop. And the mandate, the former mandate of EcoTrust Canada was around building the conservation economy, which was a concise way of describing a balance between industry and environmental health and well-being, and kind of walking that common ground, the middle ground. So the conservation economy, and the Great Bear Rainforest also is another example. It's not perfect. None of these models are perfect. I'm not saying anyone has it right now today done right, but the Great Bear Rainforest in British Columbia is another example. There's biosphere reserves. There's 18 biosphere reserves across Canada, UNESCO biosphere reserves, where they're aspiring to find a balance between environmental well-being, economic well-being, and reconciliation or social justice with Indigenous peoples. And there's 27 new IPCAs, and Indigenous protected and conserved areas are kind of the model that evolved out of over the last 4 years from the Pathway to Canada Target 1. So you can look up www.conservation2020canada.ca. There's the report and recommendations of the Indigenous Circle of Experts. We now have 27 IPCAs that are seed funded across Canada. So there's a few different examples from across Canada, but also all over the world. There's various examples of people who are trying to strike that balance and create regional, more diversified regional economic models.
I have a question about how you actually ended up putting together the like We Rise Together document, because it has so many different partners, collaborators. How I was just curious about what that process kind of looked like how you was it just a lot of traveling and a lot of conversation, or like what did that look like?
Well, so nearly 5 years ago, 4 years ago in Honolulu at the IUCN World Conservation Congress, there was a connection made with some bureaucrats from the federal government and the provincial government of Alberta They had just finished creating a fairly novel FTP process. So it's a FTP is federal, territorial, and provincial governments. So all of the environment ministers from the federal government, so that was Catherine McKenna at the time, and then several provinces and territories collaborated around an initiative called the Pathway to Canada Target 1. Canada Target 1 is the domestic or like Canadian version of a global target called Aichi Target 11 that was made by the United Nations in the Convention on Biological Diversity. So a convention, of the United Nations is like a treaty. It's a multilateral environmental agreement. You know, like the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which everybody kind of heard about. It's a treaty. It's an international agreement, and there was actually 3 multilateral environmental agreements that were all made in the early 1990s. The Convention on Climate Change, the Convention on Biological Diversity, and the UN Convention for Combating Desertification, or the Spread of Deserts. And you've probably heard of COPs, or conferences of the parties, for the climate change stuff. The UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which is referred to as UNCBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, they have COPs as well. They have conferences of the parties. And they get together every 10 years, and they set targets just like the COPs for the climate change stuff. And so the set of targets, there's 20 Aichi targets that are sunsetting on December 31st, 2020. So in several months from now, a 10-year-long effort will be concluding. And the international community, over 190 countries signed on to those Aichi targets, and each one of them domesticated their targets for application within their own countries. And Canada domesticated Aichi Target 11 to be Canada Target 1. And then they invested a whole bunch of money to figure out how are we going to achieve this target. And the target is to, by December 31st, 2020, all of the signatory countries will have created 17% of their terrestrial and inland waterways into parks or protected areas or conservation areas, and 10% of their marine and coastal environments. And so, interestingly, when the federal government, under the majority government of the Liberals in Trudeau's first term, when they had a fairly, I don't know, like lofty goals under the climate change. They're going to do the carbon offset program, and they kind of ran into a bit of a hornet's nest, on the climate file. There was a bunch of people that were against the feds for climate tax or the climate offset pricing, putting a price on carbon. And a few provinces in particular that didn't want that: Ontario, Alberta, the prairie provinces, that were willing to go to court to say that this is unconstitutional. And at the same time, Trudeau and company were trying to sell the pipelines, the oil pipelines, as climate innovations for creating a revenue stream to invest in clean tech and such. So they were basically ticking everybody off, they were, and the whole climate file was really blowing up in their faces. And so around that same time, the Convention on Biological Diversity was gaining new prominence. And so to achieve Aichi Target 11, Canada Target 1, they created this pathway to Target 1, which was an FTP process, federal, territorial, provincial governments, all of the environment ministers getting together and creating a collective strategy to implement that target. And the chairs of the National Steering Committee were in Honolulu 4 years ago, where I met up with them, and they invited me to come and see if I could help them to achieve that target. And we went about creating a committee, well, several committees, and then eventually tackling the question, how can you achieve that target? 17% terrestrial, 10% marine. How can you achieve Canada Target 1 in the spirit and practice of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples? And so we went around and we met with different Indigenous, we had 4 gatherings across the country. And then we spent a whole bunch of time with our committee to write that report, We Rise Together. And that was only meant to be an initial cut at it. We always intended that there should be a sub-regional distinctions-based approach following that. So you have Canada, which is this incredibly dynamic and diverse climatic country. Like there's all kinds of different bioclimatic regions of the country, right? You go from the Arctic to the prairies, West Coast, temperate rainforest, out into Atlantic Canada. It's just a tremendously large country, but it's also very unique geopolitically. And so our recommendation was that we should take the We Rise Together report and then tailor it to unique sub-geopolitical regions. Like British Columbia is a unique sub-region. Anything north of the 58th parallel, particularly Nunavut and the Inuit territories, are unique geopolitically. Prairie provinces, Ontario, Quebec. Quebec is very unique geopolitically. And then you've got the Atlantic provinces. So, so we always envisioned that there would be more work to be done, and there is. It's happening in different ways, but yeah, that's how we got the We Rise Together report.
We got a couple more questions here. One from Maria about what your thoughts on the Sustainable Development Goals are, and what are their value to creating or reimaging a new kind of society?
Well, it's a complex question. From a neutrino perspective, which I hold, sustainability is a bit of a poor concept. The generally accepted definition of sustainability is to meet the needs of our generation without negatively affecting the ability for future generations to meet their needs. Now, there's a plethora of ways of defining sustainability, but that's kind of the generally accepted definition that this is sustainable. From neutrino perspective and my own perspective and many other, actually, many elder societies, there's the concept of abundance and what you could call abundability instead of sustainability. We don't want to just sustain life. We want to create more abundance, to cultivate more abundance. So it's like pruning a tree at the right time of year, where you can get more yield of fruit. In New Channel law, in New Channel economic theory and practice, we have all kinds of little elegant solutions, little hacks that our ancestors have learned by observing nature for thousands of years, observing nature and how Mother Nature's economy works. And then once you can truly understand her economy, which is based on abundance, then you can create human economies that mimic that abundance. So the term sustainability is one that we always have to address when we're talking about stuff like the sustainability, the Sustainable Development Goals. Another one, just another complexity there is like, take for example, UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. UNESCO sees itself as playing a role in achieving some of the sustainability goals, right? And it's problematic because, well, I'll tell you this, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization is focused on peace building. And the old slogan is that war begins in the minds of men. Therefore, that is where we need to build peace. We need to build peace in the minds of men through education, science, and culture. Now, one of the mandate areas for under education is to bring English to all of the third world countries, the developing countries, right? In order for, we want the third world and second world countries to be like us, in the developed world. It's a hard one because we destroy our so-called developed world has destroyed so much. And most of the people that are supposed to be the victors, the ones who have gained the most, ironically, are often the least happy. That it doesn't actually have a significant increase of their well-being and their enjoyment of life. That so many of the people in the so-called developed world are on antidepressants. We're supposed to be the wealthiest country in the world, and most people are depressed and don't know how to have relationships, let alone not only with a romantic partner or with their own family, but have a sense of community. And this is advanced. This is what we want the rest of the world to look like, you know? I really question the idea, the basic idea of development, that we have to bring civilization to these undeveloped countries. You might have seen in the media a couple years ago, there was a really powerful social media campaign that was led by Africans, community members that had grown tired of this idea that of all the starving children in Africa, and that they're somehow the charity case of the world. But when you look at the statistics, the developed nations, the first world countries, the G8, the G20, they extract an incredible amount of wealth and resources out of Africa. They have these African countries in inequitable trade agreements, where they're basically, it's highway robbery. There's no two ways of looking at it. And then the audacity to turn around and say, oh, we're you're now the poverty case of the world, and we're going to put together foreign aid. And then you've got Western aid organizations that go over with the savior complex, and oftentimes it gets squandered. Anyways, I hope I'm not bursting anyone's bubbles here. I'm going on a bit of a rant about this idea of development, because, and I guess the reason why it's so harsh for me, and the reason why I take it so personally, is because we were called savages, you know. New peoples were called savages and needed civilization from the white priests, the Catholic priests. And what kind of civilization did they bring? You know, so yeah, I think there's a lot of PTSD. This should be like a post-traumatic genocide disorder or something. Um, but when you look at the way that these traditional societies, like in Africa, Ubuntu, the concept of Ubuntu, um, I wouldn't claim to know them all, but I know that around the world there are many examples of traditional societies, elder societies that have figured out how to like answer the basic question of what makes a life worth living, and how can we design and develop our societies and our economies in a way that honors um, equitable access to resources and whatnot. So there's a lot of mixed thought and feelings. I mean, inherently, the idea of the sustainability goals there's a lot of good there, but we have to be careful that sometimes, you know, sometimes even the best of intended people can end up doing a lot of harm and interfering with the self-determination of others. And so I'll end with this. Like when I was in university, um, I studied the concept of human security. So you can look it up, human security. In 2001, there was the R2P, the responsibility to protect, that was introduced into international law, where it was held by the dominant state actors that if a nation state fails to provide for the basic human security of their domestic populations, then they run the risk of forfeiting their sovereignty and opening themselves up to legitimate intervention by the global community to interfere with their sovereignty. And this was on the heels of the Cold War, where dominant state actors routinely interfered with the sovereignty of so-called satellite states that were the proxy wars, the playing grounds for proxy wars between the former Soviet Union and the United States of America. And arguably, the notion of human security was adapted to open up a new vein, because during the Cold War, dominant state actors, you know, would routinely interfere with the sovereignty of satellite states based on the principle of national security. In other words, if I'm the United States of America, and if I'm not proactive about affecting satellite states, then communism could be knocking on our door. And vice versa, the Soviet Union sought to influence satellite states, otherwise capitalism would be knocking at their door. And so there was this routine intervention with sovereignty that happened during the Cold War. And then with the fall of Berlin and the end of the former Soviet Union, um, arguably, the dominant state actors required a new logic to interfere, and they did so. Interestingly, like Iraq, for example, like think about the messaging that happened by George W. Bush in going into Iraq. We need to bring democracy and liberty to the poor people of Iraq, you know. And now retrospectively, we see that the weapons of mass destruction were not there, and that Saddam Hussein could not be actually pinpointed as the driving force behind 9/11. Anyways, now I'm really going down a rabbit hole. But the point being is that we need to be reflective about the Sustainable Development Goals, and that we don't necessarily want all of the world to live as we do. And we shouldn't be living as we do, quite frankly. And sometimes, if we want to improve the life of our neighbors, perhaps it's not something that we need to start doing. It's things we need to stop doing.
There's one more question in here. It's a long one, so hold with me. With the shift in economies, one project here in Ontario that comes to mind is the Henby Inlet Wind Project. It created hundreds of jobs along the shores of Georgian Bay. This was very polarizing because it created great financial incentives for the Anishinaabe in this First Nation, but it caused a division among the people that were first and foremost protectors of the land. How are projects like this weighed in terms of economical benefit versus cultural or territorial loss?
Yeah, I guess I think that if it is from the inner volition of the people, like if it's their true self-determination and they do harm to themselves, then I think that's always been for me a bit of an interesting psychological moral compass. Like who am I to go into another person's land and tell them how to live? So if it's truly from their inner volition and their own self-determination, that's what they want to do, then I have to respect that personally. Now, I don't necessarily have to support it, and and so if there's any level of duress and or bribery, and you know, bribery is a loaded word, but if the political decision making has been influenced with either threats or um, benefits like financial incentives, then you can now say maybe it is not their inner volition, but that they have been either bullied or bribed into doing something. Now, would you rather have wind power or a nuclear plant? This is, I don't know if you guys have watched that show, Last Man on Earth. It's a really good series to watch right now. But when the poop hits the fan, you don't want a nuclear reactor in your backyard that's gone derelict and is ready to melt down at a given point in time. So it's sort of a lesser of two evils thing that comes into my brain at the same time. So anyways, I don't know how helpful that was, but those are my two reflections.
That's great. Thank you, Eli. Do we have any last minute questions here? I think might be kind of where we wrap it up. Would you be willing, Eli, to answer questions through email if our participants have them? We could forward them
Yeah,
on.
for sure.
Awesome. No, that'd be great. Yeah,
And
thank
we're
you very
doing-
much.
Yeah, and we're doing a little series while I'm quarantined at home called ESOC Talks. I sent Caitlin the link, I think.
Yeah, I think we've linked it to the, if you go to Eli's National Call page, we've linked it there, but we can also send it out to everyone in follow-up.
All right, awesome. Okay, thanks for the great questions, folks, and all of your kind attention. Have a great day.